the all-powerful, the Most High, the Almighty. Whatever you decide to call him, God, as depicted in the Bible, is a homicidal maniac. What I just said is indeed a very polarizing statement, one that would make even the most hardcore religious fanatic cringe. But I am going to explain how I can justify referring to God as a homicidal maniac. Just how the God of the Bible is responsible for numerous cases of unjustified killing. The unjustified killing that I am referring to ranges from senseless murder to all-out genocide. God, as depicted in the Bible, seems to more often than not disregard who is innocent and who is guilty. With that said, there is simply no way for a reasonable or prudent person to confuse this God with being all-loving or benevolent. But let's look a little deeper at some events that's right out of the Bible. When this so-called benevolent, all-loving God unleashed his fury on newborn babies, animals, and even plants. Yes, you heard that right, plants, as in the ones that grow from the soil. God has committed such senseless, unnecessary, horrific acts that, if a typical human being were to commit, would surely land that person not in prison, but a mental asylum, chained to a bed with padded walls, and spoon-fed each meal, because he would not only pose a threat to others, but himself as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. The most well-known case of God being a homicidal maniac is the flood of Genesis 7, where God himself killed every man, woman, child, infant, animal, or plant on earth, with the exception of one family and a boat full of animals. The events of Genesis 7 goes far beyond practical genocide and more into comical levels of destruction. Famously, in Exodus 7 through 12, God has Moses ask to let the Israelite slaves go worship in the wilderness so they can plot an escape. When Pharaoh refuses, God sends plights on every worker, slave, and child in Egypt. In other words, those individuals were faced with dangerous, difficult, or otherwise unfortunate situations. Their food sources are destroyed, their water turned to undrinkable blood, upon other things. Finally, God kills the firstborn male children of every family in Egypt, even the slaves, just for being associated with Egypt. He discerns who to kill and who not to kill by whether they killed a lamb and smeared its blood on their houses. Shortly after, in Exodus 14, God has the Israelites lure the Egyptians to the Red Sea, where he parts the waters miraculously for the Israelites to cross, and then drowns everyone in Egypt's army. This whole time, God takes credit for hardening Pharaoh's heart. In Numbers 31, God commands Moses and the Israelites to seek vengeance on the Midianites. They are ordered to kill every man, woman, and child, regardless of status or occupation, and yes, slave infants were also included. However, they were ordered to let virgin girls live for themselves. Moses gets angry that non-virgin women are left alive. It was mentioned elsewhere in the Bible that men were authorized by God to claim female prisoners of war as their wives if they liked the way she looked naked, and send her out for nothing if they changed their mind. So, on top of being a homicidal maniac, this God has some toxic masculinity to go with it. In Deuteronomy 7, God orders the Israelites to annihilate 7 nations: the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. God promises to inflict all of the same diseases on these people as he did on Egypt, but to spare the Israelites. Being the angry maniac that he is, God threatens a disproportionate punishment on anyone who associate themselves with any member of the aforementioned 7 nations. Well, it seems as though all of God's punishments are disproportionate, so we shouldn't be surprised now, should we? Now, just so I'm clear, God did not use the term disproportionate. However, when he made his threats, the punishment he was talking about did not fit the crime. Speaking of disproportionate punishments, in Deuteronomy 13, God commands the killing of anyone who worships another god, including that person's family. If a few people in the same city worship other gods, everyone in the city is to be slaughtered, and livestock killed, and everything of value burned, and nothing shall be built there again. This is light years beyond insane. If there were ever a disproportionate punishment administered by God, this one probably takes the cake. Let's think about it for a moment. If a few people in a town follow the wrong religion, slaughter them, their children, and their animals, and destroy their house, while you're at it, go ahead and burn down everyone else's house too, even if those individuals are non-religious and had absolutely nothing to do with the ones God had a problem with. No, everyone gets punished equally, or disproportionately, I should say. That said, this cannot be the so-called all-loving God. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 17, all of the occupants of Jericho, with the exception of Rahab and her family, are slain. Even the kids are massacred. Then, in Joshua chapter 8, verse 1 through 29, they set an entire city on fire, trapping the people inside. Anyone who got away was pursued and slaughtered. Surprisingly, women are not included this time. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 3, the mentally unstable God orders the complete and utter destruction of the Amalekites and is careful to specify infants and animals. As you see, God continuously disregards innocent lives. In the rest of 1 Samuel chapter 15, God gets angry at them for not killing everything, and the prophet Samuel kills the king of Amalek and hacks him into pieces in a very dramatic way. The entire book of Job is a story about how Satan challenges God, saying that Job, who is a righteous man, would not be loyal to God if things went wrong for him. To prove Satan wrong, God permits Satan to do all kinds of awful things. Job is afflicted with ailments, his family is killed, even his livestock dies. Finally, God loses his bet, and Job questions him. God refuses to justify himself, and being the unstable nutjob that he is, probably got very angry for being questioned. He then allows Job to produce a new family, and seems to consider this an improvement on his situation. Of course, there are many more similar stories of what seems to be a never-ending nightmare of massacre, committed by none other than the so-called benevolent God. Now, we are assuming these events in the Bible are actually true. Let's look back at Genesis, the flood, and the savage nature of the Most High. This is a form of torture, keeping in mind how death by drowning is not instantaneous and is normally quite stressful and painful. And to think almost all of humanity was tortured to death in this manner. Not being satisfied with that, God went on to torture the animals of that period of time. A countless number of sentient creatures, inflicted completely unnecessarily and completely unjustified suffering, all at the whim of a madman. As we mentioned earlier, God chose to kill every single Egyptian firstborn, not because of faults of their own, but to put pressure on Pharaoh. In this day and age, we would describe this as a form of terrorism, targeting innocents as a means to achieve a political goal. Again, let's go back to the Genesis flood narrative, when God spared Noah, his family, and a pair of all of the world's animals from a global submerge. Let's ask ourselves a question. How was it feasible to get a pair of every single animal on board the ark? It is said that Noah brought males and females on board for the purpose of reproducing after the flood, in order to preserve the lineage of each kind. However, what is not explained is how carnivores were fed if there were only 2 of each animal. A lion, for example, is a hypercarnivore, meaning they skip their veggies and only eat meat. So how could such an animal be sustained and kept healthy without starving? In another example, ants. Ants make up an enormously diverse array of insects, with more than 12,000 identified species as of today. So, were a pair of the 12,000 ant species collected, or were there simply just 2 ants on board the entire ark? Even if there were only 2, if one just so happened to die, there would be no chance of reproduction, so I assume that entire species would go extinct. Yes, there are many more questions to be asked, but the point is, when we look a little deeper into these stories with an open mind, it is quite apparent they are filled with inaccuracies and inconsistencies. So we've come to this conclusion. Either all of this stuff in the Bible was completely made up, which is very likely, and further reinforces the fact that religion is BS, or everything is true, which reinforces the fact that God is some sort of narcissistic, mentally unstable lunatic. But let's just pretend that those stories of the Bible are true. Now, keep in mind, this is the God that they force us to worship, a destructive one, with little regard for those that are innocent. Based on the Bible stories I shared with you, it seems as though this God enjoys torturing and killing its own creation. Seems as though this God, more often than not, administers a disproportionate punishment, one that is unfair and does not fit the crime. For example, let's look back at Deuteronomy 13. Now for a moment, imagine your entire town being savagely massacred, including animals, all because God didn't like a handful of people worshiping a different God. Religious people will watch this video and argue that the punishment for sin is death. But what they fail to realize is that the punishment of death, as far as God is concerned, does not only affect the guilty, but the innocent as well. These religious people do not worship and respect God out of love. No, they worship and respect God out of fear. Religion has them brainwashed and they are terrified. Personally, I do not worship or fear God. Just with these Bible stories I shared with you, and not including all of the other issues that are faced in today's time, I think it's safe to say that God is utterly useless and unworthy of worship. After all, any God that willfully and deliberately kills innocent babies should be considered evil, right?
That the Bible was compiled over time by the church, and many texts were excluded from the final canon, and some of these texts, known as the Gnostic texts, were deemed too controversial and heretical for inclusion in the Bible, and were banned by the church. Now, among these banned books are the Secret Book of John and the Testimony of Truth. The Secret Book of John reveals that the Garden of Eden was actually a trap, and the Testimony of Truth says that the serpent was actually a hero, a liberator, and that God is an evil entity trapping souls on earth. The Testimony of Truth goes into detail describing how evil God is. It says, "But what sort is this God? First, he maliciously refused Adam from eating of the tree of knowledge, and secondly, he said, 'Adam, where are you? God does not have foreknowledge? Would he not know from the beginning?' And afterwards he said, 'Let us cast him out of this place, lest he eat from the tree of life and live forever.'"